Have you ever been told your idea was foolish? That your creation was a joke? What if that very joke could turn the tide of a battle? What if ridicule was the last sound you heard, right before you made history? On February 12, 1945, at precisely 4:47 in the afternoon, in the wooded hills near Epernay, France, a 22-year-old American infantryman named Jack Bigham lay flat against the cold, unforgiving earth. He was a sniper with the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, part of the legendary 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army. The late winter air was thick, a biting cocktail of cordite, damp pine, and the metallic tang of fear. In his hands rested a Springfield M1903A4 rifle, the standard-issue American sniper weapon of the war, but with one very unusual feature. The scope mounted to it was not military grade. It was something he had built himself. His fellow soldiers had roared with laughter when they first saw it. A scope fashioned from the cracked lens tube of a broken medical microscope. A steel ring, scavenged from a dismantled German artillery fuse, held it in place. Dials marked by hand with crude pencil notches. It looked absurd, amateurish, a child's toy on a deadly instrument. They called it his toy. They called Jack delusional. Some even whispered he would get himself killed trying to play engineer on a live battlefield. But now, just 27 seconds later, those same men watched, mouths agape, as a German Panzer IV tank, positioned more than 200 yards away, that is approximately 1,100 meters, suddenly, violently, erupted in a blossom of fire and twisted steel. The explosion ripped through the valley, a guttural roar that dwarfed the sound of any rifle. It was not artillery. It was not an airstrike. It was one man, one bullet, and one homemade scope. They no longer laughed. This is the true and unbelievable story of Jack "Red Bigham, the American soldier they mocked for inventing his own sniper optic, until the moment he used it to change the course of a battle. It is a story about doubt, innovation, and the one impossible shot that echoed into history. Blueprints in the dirt. In the bitter winter of 1944, as the last major German offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, tore through the snow-laden Ardennes, the men of the 4th Infantry Division were cold to the bone, utterly exhausted, and pushing eastward inch by bloody inch. By early February of 1945, the front had crawled into the Champagne-Ardenne region of northeastern France. There, in the rolling hills and dense skeletal forests near Epernay, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known simply as 2-3, had been assigned a daunting task: to probe and weaken the German defenses entrenched just beyond the Bois de Ligne Ridge. Among them was a quiet young infantryman named Jack Bigham. He hailed from Marshall, Kansas, a farming town of fewer than 10,000 people, where the sky was wide and the horizons were long. Before the war, Jack had never held a rifle in combat. He was a mechanic by trade, a tinkerer by temperament. At 19, he had apprenticed under his uncle at a watch repair shop, a world of miniature gears and delicate springs. He could rebuild a stopwatch with his eyes closed, his hands possessing a supernatural stillness, adjusting the micro gears with such precision that older customers joked he must have nerves made of ice. When Jack was drafted in the spring of 1943, those same skills made him an anomaly at Fort Benning. During marksmanship training, he impressed his instructors not just with his accuracy, but with his method. He adjusted for windage and elevation intuitively, without being told how. He measured distances in his head using trees, fence lines, even the slow crawl of shadows. But with no formal sniper program in place and a critical shortage of scopes, Jack was assigned as a regular rifleman. By the time the Battle of the Bulge sputtered to its end in January of 1945, the Army was forced to admit a severe shortfall. It lacked trained sharpshooters. Many of its scopes, like the Weaver Model 330C, had broken, fogged over in the damp cold, or simply gone missing in the chaos of retreat and advance. Resupply was a logistical nightmare. In the entire 2-3 battalion, there were only 3 scoped rifles. Jack saw this problem not as a deficit, but as an opportunity. In early February, stationed near Epernay, Jack quietly asked to visit the battalion's field hospital. There, he salvaged a broken microscope, an American-built Bausch and Lomb model, its casing cracked during a bumpy transport. He carefully extracted the lens tube and began fashioning it into an optical sight. For mounting brackets, he scavenged a heavy steel ring from a destroyed German 88 mm shell casing he found in a ditch. Over 2 nights, cloaked in darkness and secrecy, he soldered, filed, and balanced the contraption onto the barrel of his standard Springfield 1903A4. When he finally showed it to his squad, they burst out laughing. "That thing looks like it belongs in a science fair," one of them guffawed. "Hey, Big Gam, you going to diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut?" Another jeered. Even his platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Miller, dismissed it with a weary shrug. "It ain't regulation, son. Don't come crying to me when it shatters on your first shot and takes your eye with it." But Jack didn't flinch. He believed in the tool because he had built it, piece by agonizing piece. He had tested its range in the woods just west of their encampment, tracking tree lines and measuring consistency. The scope wasn't perfect. The image had a faint bluish tint. The primary lens scratched easily, and the zero drifted with sharp temperature changes. But it worked. It magnified. It aligned. And most importantly, it was the only scope available to him. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be useful. In the rigid hierarchy of the American Army in 1945, innovation was something that came from the top down, from labs and factories far from the front. Jack Bigegam was about to prove the opposite, that sometimes, in war, the most critical advances are born not in sterile laboratories, but in mud, under fire, and in the grease-stained hands of a quiet young man who refuses to settle for standard issue. 1,000 to 200 yards of doubt. Jack Bigegam never asked for permission to build his scope. He knew better. In the army, improvisation wasn't encouraged unless it came from the top brass. But what he did ask for, quietly, respectfully, was time. Time at night. Time alone. Time to make something better than what he had been issued, which was precisely nothing. During those frigid early February nights in 1945, Jack worked under a canvas tarp stretched between 2 pines, just beyond the tree line west of Epernay. He wrapped his gear in burlap and oilcloth to muffle the telltale clink of metal tools. His only light was a standard-issue flashlight, its beam diffused through a piece of red cellophane stolen from a medic's signaling kit, casting a bloody, secretive glow on his work. He kept notes in a tiny sweat-stained ledger, calculating distances, crosswind drift, and minute adjustments for temperature changes. He was methodical, obsessive, utterly focused. He dismantled the microscope tube into its 3 main components: the objective lens, the focus ring, and the ocular. Then, he mounted the system onto the Springfield rifle's receiver, using 2 hand-fashioned rings clamped with scavenged bolts from a German motorcycle. The vertical reticule, the essential crosshair, was a masterstroke of desperate ingenuity. A single, impossibly thin strand of copper wire, removed from a field telephone cable, stretched taut across a ring of dental cement he'd procured from a medic. It wasn't pretty, but it was precise. Every evening after dusk, as the other men cleaned their rifles or wrote letters home, Jack would walk to a clearing known as Red Hill, named not for blood but for the iron-rich soil that stained their boots a deep rust color. There, he practiced. He set up rusted German helmets on fence posts at different distances. At first 200 yards, then 400, then 600. Each night he walked a bit farther back, pushing the limits of his creation. He made notes, measured the angle of the bullet's fall, tracked how the homemade lens held up in the biting cold. The scope fogged slightly in the freezing air. But he found a solution, applying a thin, almost invisible film of soap to the interior glass and polishing it off. It worked well enough. Jack never spoke much to the others during these drills. They knew where he went. Some watched from a distance, amused. Others ignored him, writing him off as an oddball. His platoon sergeant warned him once, sternly. "You are wasting ammunition we don't have, Begum." Jack replied only once, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I'll bring the brass back clean." By February 10th, the division's intelligence reports had confirmed increased German armor movement near the Bois de Laine, particularly models identified as Panzerkampfwagen 4. These tanks, often shortened to Panzer IV, had been the backbone of German armored divisions for most of the war. The version most commonly seen in that sector was the Ausführung H, or H variant, outfitted with deadly 75 mm high-velocity guns and frontal armor as thick as 80 mm. For an infantryman, getting caught in the open by a panzer was a death sentence. The usual solutions were air support, anti-tank artillery, or bazookas fired from dangerously close range. A rifle, even a sniper rifle, had no business engaging one. But Jack wasn't planning to pierce armor. He had studied the diagrams of the Panzer IV scavenged from a captured manual. He knew the layout. He knew the engine deck at the rear housed the fuel intake caps, which were often left exposed or improperly sealed when refueling in a hurry. He had seen it more than once. Spare fuel canisters strapped to the back of German armor columns. It was standard operating procedure, easy to reach, but also terribly vulnerable. If he could aim for that, not the hull, not the turret, but a soft, unprotected, flammable target, he might not destroy the tank outright. But he could set it ablaze, force it to stop, force the crew out, create chaos. That would be enough. His plan wasn't crazy, it was calculated. But nobody believed in it. Not yet. With the enemy advancing, by February 11th, 1945, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment had advanced to the outskirts of the Bois de Laine, a miserable patch of forest overlooking a shallow, muddy valley near the Marne River. The 4th Infantry Division had orders to push through the German lines, weaken the last stubborn pockets of resistance, and secure high ground for the coming spring offensive into Germany itself. But something wasn't right. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Scouts reported increased armor traffic along a dirt road that twisted through the tree line. It was narrow, mired in mud, and largely invisible from the air, perfect for moving tanks without drawing the attention of Allied fighter bombers. Intelligence confirmed it. At least 3 Panzer IV tanks were dug in along the western edge of the forest, rotating guard shifts every 6 hours. The Germans were preparing for a stand. That morning, during a command briefing in a hastily dug out command post, Lieutenant Colonel Harris turned to his platoon leaders, his face grim. He made an unusual request. He wanted a sharpshooter in position by daybreak the following morning, someone quiet, steady, and familiar with the terrain. The mission was simple but lethal. Observe and, if possible, disrupt German vehicle movements without engaging infantry. Cause confusion, pick off officers, foresee a delay. One name came up, hesitantly at first, then with a note of grudging respect, Big Gum. Jack was summoned to the command tent, where Harris looked him over like a man inspecting a piece of equipment he didn't quite trust. "I hear you've been playing scientist with a rifle, Big Gum," Harris said, his voice flat. "Yes, sir." "You think that thing of yours can hit anything past 400 yards? "I know it can, sir." Harris didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just handed Jack a map and circled a spot labeled Grid 17 Alpha. It was an elevated thicket of pine trees about 1,200 yards from the suspected German tank positions. It offered a clear line of sight, but it was a long, unforgiving shot. Longer than regulation, longer than any doctrine recommended. "You'll go in before dawn. No backup, no noise, no second chances." "Yes, sir." That night, Jack packed light. His Springfield rifle with a homemade scope. 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each one hand-selected for consistency. A pair of wire cutters, 2 canteens, 1 chocolate bar. No sidearm. He didn't expect to fight his way out. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, he moved out alone, a ghost cutting through the frost-covered fields toward Grid 17 Alpha. He reached the ridge shortly after midnight and dug himself a shallow scrape beneath a fallen pine, pulling branches over himself. Above him, the moon filtered through a thin cloud cover, casting long silver shadows across the treetops. The night was deathly quiet. No insects, no wind, just the distant heavy thud of artillery and the occasional nervous bark of a German machine gun far to the east. Jack adjusted his scope. He marked tiny notches on a branch above his position to track the changing wind. He measured the distance again and again using fence posts and the width of the valley floor. He double-checked the tension on the mounting rings. Everything was tight, aligned. He lay prone, motionless for nearly 6 hours. Just before dawn, a column of smoke appeared on the horizon. The Panzer was moving. Slow, intentional. It emerged from the trees and paused just beyond the ridge line, its engine rumbling. Steam hissed from its exhaust pipes. A crew member, bareheaded, probably the loader, stepped out and began refueling from an external jerrycan strapped to the rear hull. It was exactly what Jack had been waiting for. One mistake. One exposed canister. One chance. He exhaled slowly. 200 yards. A target no bigger than a lunchbox, less than 3 seconds of visibility. He steadied the crosshairs. His finger moved to the trigger. The world fell silent. The trigger that changed everything. 200 yards. That is 1,100 meters, almost 3/4 of a mile, across a muddy French valley, shrouded in the ghostly tendrils of early morning fog. No spotter, no support, no guarantee. Just one man, one rifle, and one improvised scope that everyone had called a joke. Jack Begum steadied his breath, feeling the icy air burn his lungs. His body was as still as the frozen ground beneath him, but his mind raced, a furious engine of calculation. He could see the tank now, framed clearly in the cold morning light. A German Panzer IV Ausführung H, heavy with mud and frost. Its long 75mm cannon angled slightly downward as it idled in place, a sleeping metal beast. Behind it, 2 crewmen were refueling from a canister strapped to the rear hull. They moved with a hurried, almost careless confidence, assuming they were safe. The American front line was over a kilometer away. No one would dare shoot from that far. Jack's eyes narrowed until the world was nothing but the view through his strange, blue-tinted lens. He was not aiming for the tank's turret or its thick, sloped hull. That would be suicide. The Panzer's armor, 80mm thick at the front, was more than enough to shrug off a rifle round. Even from a high-powered 30-06 Springfield, the bullet would flatten like a coin against that hardened steel. But Jack wasn't trying to punch through steel. He was aiming for something soft, something flammable. He had studied this, rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. German refueling procedures were often rushed, especially under the constant pressure of the front. If the crew left the cap loose, or spilled even a few ounces of gasoline near the hot engine intake, it could catch fire. And if that fire reached the ammunition stowed just inside, near the engine bay, well, then even a single rifle round could trigger something far, far worse. He aligned the reticle. That hand-painted wire, a single strand of scavenged copper, stretched across the view like a delicate cross of light. The wind had calmed. Just a light breeze from the west, maybe 3 miles per hour. He adjusted for drift. 1/4 inch left at the muzzle would mean several feet off target at that impossible distance. He inhaled once, held it, and squeezed. The recoil kicked gently, predictably into his shoulder. The report of the shot, a sharp, clean crack, ripped across the silent valley. And for a moment, just one eternal moment, nothing happened. Then it did. A spark. A hiss. A sudden, silent bloom of orange flame. The jerrycan exploded first, showering the 2 crewmen with burning fuel. One of them screamed, a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the roar. The second tried to run, a human torch stumbling through the mud. Flames licked up the rear of the tank, catching on the engine grate, then crawling greedily inward. And then, with a sound like thunder stuffed inside a metal drum, the ammunition inside the Panzer cooked off. The tank detonated from the rear, a massive, concussive fireball, punching upward into the pine-scraped sky, sending a plume of black smoke and shrapnel cartwheeling through the air. Big Gum never moved. His finger slid off the trigger. He watched, his eyes still pressed to the scope, as smoke billowed into the morning light, as chaos erupted among the nearby German troops who scrambled to understand what had just happened. Some pointed, others dove for cover. No one could locate the source of the shot. It was too far, too clean, too precise. Back on the American side, soldiers from 2-3 watched in stunned, reverent silence. They had heard the single, lonely shot. Then they saw the fire, and then the explosion. At first, no one said anything. Then a corporal muttered, "No, way, that wasn't Big Gum, was it?" Another replied, his voice filled with awe, "He's the only one out there." By the time Jack crawled back into the tree line hours later, his hands were raw from the cold. His face was speckled with dirt. He looked utterly exhausted. And when he returned to the forward operating post, no one laughed, no one scoffed. They just looked at the rifle, then at the strange, ugly scope, and then at him. There were no medals, no ceremony, just a heavy, quiet awe. Jack Bigegam had just made the impossible shot with a rifle no one trusted and a scope no one believed in. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When the mocking stopped, when Jack Bigegam returned to base that afternoon, the water around him hadn't changed. The mud was still deep, the air still cold, the threat of death still constant. But something else had. The way people looked at him, the tone in their voices, the profound silence that replaced the usual sarcasm and cheap jokes. The men they once called Scope Boy or Optics Jack now walked among them with a quiet gravity. Not because he had asked for respect, but because he had earned it with a single perfectly placed round. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Harris received a terse message from battalion headquarters. German radio intercepts, decoded by SIGINT, had noted a suspected, long-range, high-precision American sniper attack on an armored unit. The Panzer that had gone up in flames, its serial number now unknown, had been part of a mobile counterattack force meant to halt the 4th Infantry's eastward push. It never got the chance. Jack's single shot had not just destroyed a tank, it had crippled a planned tactical movement, and in doing so, it created a ripple of fear. German tank crews along that sector began changing their procedures. Fuel canisters were now stored farther from the rear deck or inside accompanying supply trucks. Refueling was delayed until vehicles were under heavy cover. Hatches were kept closed unless absolutely necessary. That kind of systemic adjustment didn't come from a rumor. It came from fear. The command staff of 2-3 called Jack in for a formal debrief the next morning. The officers, men with eagles on their collars who had never given him a second glance, wanted to know everything. His process, his calculations, his scope. He brought it in. The handmade optic, now blackened slightly from powder residue and frost, looked even more crude under the harsh light of the command tent's lantern. He explained how he had used a broken Bausch and Lomb microscope, how he had calibrated it using match marks and painstaking trial and error, and how he had painted his reticle from a single wire strand taken from a communications cable. They took notes, real notes. For the first time, people listened. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the device, and asked bluntly, "Could you teach this?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." The next week, he was temporarily reassigned to division-level training. Not permanently, just long enough to share his unorthodox methods with a few hand-picked riflemen from across the 4th Infantry. His lessons were simple but powerful. Improvise with precision. Measure everything. Trust your instincts, but verify them with the data. One of the sergeants from his own platoon, a man who had once mocked Jack relentlessly, asked to borrow the scope, just to look through it. Jack let him. The man held it up to the light, squinted, frowned at the bluish tint, and then handed it back. "This thing is ugly as sin," he muttered. "But damn, son, it works." Back at camp, word spread beyond their unit. Another battalion sent a runner asking if the Kansas sniper could demonstrate his technique. A major from division staff showed up unannounced, asking for a written summary of the scope's construction. It seemed no one could get over the fact that a homemade scope, cobbled together in the woods with the scrap parts and the solder, had done what no regulation sniper rifle had ever done in that sector. It had stopped a tank, not by destroying it with brute force, but by outthinking it. Jack didn't gloat. He wasn't built for that. He kept to himself, as always. He spent his evenings rechecking the scope's zero, cleaning the rifle's bolt, and running his fingers along the cold steel barrel, like a mechanic inspecting the engine of a beloved car. He knew better than anyone. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing reliability. The rifle, the scope, and the shot had become one story. His story. And though he never asked for recognition, the army was now watching him closely. Because in a war of machines and mass production, Jack Big Gum had proven something ancient and profound. That sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not what you're issued, but what you build with your own two hands. The war ends. But the legacy begins. The war would grind on for another 3 brutal months. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The guns finally fell silent across Europe. The great cities lay in ruin. The fields in places like Champagne, Normandy, and the Ardennes were littered with rusting steel. A graveyard of ambition, with memories soaked deep into the mud. For most soldiers, including Corporal Jack Big Gum, there was no grand ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just orders. Orders to pack up, return home, and forget, or try to, what they had seen. Jack went back to Kansas in the summer of that year. The town of Marshall welcomed him quietly, with knowing nods and firm handshakes, not with parades. His parents had kept his workshop in the back of the garage exactly as he had left it. The same tools hung on the wall. The same collection of broken watches lay in a tray on his workbench. A small notebook was still open on the table, its last entry marked in neat graphite pencil. 3. Drift at 500 PLH, 5 ppm crosswind. He never spoke much about what happened overseas. When neighbors asked about the war, he'd offer a polite, reserved smile and say, "I did my part." That was enough. But the rifle came home with him. The Springfield M1903A4, along with the homemade scope, still scratched, still patched with wire, and a hint of dental cement. It sat in a locked gun cabinet for years, a silent testament, untouched. In the 1950s, Jack was invited to speak at a local Veterans of Foreign Wars gathering. He brought the rifle and scope not to brag, but to show what a man could do with the right motivation and the right mindset. The audience of fellow veterans, men who understood the language of silence and survival, listened quietly as he told the story. Not just of the shot, but of the ridicule, the failure, the perseverance. He ended with a sentence that would later be etched on a small brass plaque next to his display in the Regional War Museum. "It was never about the scope," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It was about believing that I could make something better, even when no one else believed it with me." The army never formally adopted Jack's design. It was too crude, too specific to his own unique set of skills. But his story made its way into the unofficial lore of infantry sharpshooting. During the Korean War and even into Vietnam, instructors at Fort Benning would occasionally tell new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and took out a tank. The details were often exaggerated, as war stories are prone to be, but the core truth remained. One soldier's willingness to think differently had made a measurable, undeniable difference. In the late 70s, a military historian researching improvised weapons of World War II tracked Jack down. They spoke for hours. Jack, now a man in his 50s with the same steady eyes, showed him the scope, which he now stored in a padded case lined with soft flannel. The historian took careful notes and later published a chapter in a little-known but respected book titled Tools of Last Resort: Ingenuity in Combat. That same year, Jack donated the rifle and scope to the Kansas Military History Center. It still sits there today, preserved in a glass case beneath a faded photograph of a young man with a square jaw, clear, steady eyes, and grease-stained fingers. Most visitors walk past without noticing. Another rifle among many. But some stop. They lean in, read the caption, and trace the scratches in the steel with their eyes. And in that moment, they understand. This wasn't a story about a war hero crowned with medals and fanfare. It was a story about a quiet mechanic who refused to accept the word impossible. Jack Bigham never sought a legacy, but he left one anyway. A legacy of quiet defiance, of brilliant improvisation, and of the profound power held in the hands of the individual. How one bullet changed doctrine. Jack Bigham never considered himself a strategist. He didn't wear stars on his shoulders or sit in cavernous war rooms drawing arrows on maps. He was a corporal, a field man, a trigger puller who just happened to think differently about tools. But sometimes history is nudged forward, not by the grand plans of generals, but by the quiet actions of practitioners. In the months following the Panzer incident, Jack's story, and more importantly the report of his story, passed quietly through the bureaucratic channels of the 4th Infantry Division, eventually making its way into after-action reports and field evaluations. Though it was never listed as official doctrine, the implications were too powerful to ignore. First, the Army realized it had severely underestimated the potential of field innovation. Jack had taken broken parts, a damaged microscope, steel from artillery fragments, scrap wire, and turned them into something lethally functional under extreme fire. That alone was a powerful lesson in resourcefulness in an army built on standardization. Second, he had identified a critical tactical blind spot. Most sniper training at the time emphasized infantry targets: officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. Very few, if any, ever considered the idea that a sniper could influence armored warfare. Jack had shown that under specific, albeit rare conditions, a well-placed rifle shot could disrupt or even destroy a multi-ton vehicle if the target wasn't the armor, but the vulnerability behind it. In response, several after-action reviews began recommending expanded sniper training, including the detailed identification of soft spots on enemy equipment. A small but significant clause was added to a post-war field manual in the late 1940s. Personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. It didn't mention Jack by name, but that single sentence was born from his single shot. Third, Jack's success reignited conversations about sniper doctrine itself. During World War II, the US military had trailed behind both the Soviets and the Germans in sniper development. The Soviets, with legendary figures like Vasily Zaitsev, fielded over 20,000 trained snipers by the war's end. The Germans were feared for their precision optics and rigorous training. By contrast, the American approach was often decentralized, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on whatever equipment was available at the time. Jack's homemade scope, crude as it was, forced officers to ask a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What if we empowered soldiers to innovate at the front rather than forcing them to wait for top-down solutions? In the 1950s, the Army began investing more seriously in optics standardization and dedicated sniper training programs. By the time the Vietnam War arrived, snipers like Carlos Hathcock were no longer an afterthought. They were a strategic asset. Rifles were better, optics were clearer, doctrine was sharper. No, Jack Bigham didn't build all of that by himself, but he had proven something vital. That battlefield intelligence wasn't just about gathering information. It was about recognizing when the battlefield itself demanded adaptation. Today, in modern military training programs around the world, Soldiers still lace toast, still study the vulnerability points on vehicles. They are taught to think critically under pressure, to identify unconventional solutions, and in some special forces units, to fabricate or modify their gear when supply lines fail. Those lessons didn't come from a textbook theory. They came from the mud, from the cold, from a quiet man in a forest in France who refused to believe that standard issue was the same as only option. One shot, one scope, one quiet act of defiance against doctrine, and from it, a ripple that would echo through generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers who came to understand a fundamental truth. Precision is not always about the tool. Sometimes it's about the will behind it. In every war, there are names etched into monuments. Generals, battles, victories, dates. But history is also shaped in quieter moments. Not with fanfare, not with headlines, but with one decision, one hand-built solution, one act of defiance that no one saw coming. Jack Bigegam never raised his voice. He never wrote a book or claimed to be a hero. He didn't chase medals, and he didn't try to change the army. But his story, one man, one rifle, one improvised scope, challenges how we think about courage, skill, and innovation under pressure. His defining moment didn't come in a blaze of glory. It came in stillness, in control, in the quiet belief that he could see what others couldn't, and hit what others thought was impossible. The truth is, most of us are told to follow the manual, to stay in line, to wait for approval. And yet every single breakthrough in history, in science, in art, in war, in human progress, has come from someone who decided, this isn't good enough. I can make it better. Jack's homemade scope wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a statement that ideas matter, even if they look ridiculous at first. That perseverance is often mocked right up until the moment it succeeds. That sometimes, the only difference between a failure and a breakthrough is the willingness to try anyway. Think about the battlefield he was on. Mud, fear, cold, steel. A world where conformity keeps you alive. And in that world, this quiet man, with nothing but a cracked microscope lens and a steel ring from enemy shrapnel, changed the course of a battle. Not by following orders, but by thinking beyond them. We live in a time now where technology surrounds us, where precision is engineered, where our tools are factory-made, digital, and exact. And yet the spirit that drove Jack Bigam is more relevant than ever. Because we all still face challenges that can't be solved with standard issue thinking. Problems that require someone willing to say, I'll build it myself. I'll figure it out. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've been told your idea won't work, that it looks strange, that it's a waste of time, that nobody does it that way. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why you should keep going. Jack's story reminds us that innovation isn't a department. It's a mindset. And sometimes, the smallest change in the hands of someone determined can ripple farther than anyone imagines. One man, one lens, one bullet, and a moment that still speaks to us 80 years later. What about you? What part of Jack Bigigan's story hit you hardest? Was it the laughter he faced, the silence after the shot, or the quiet legacy no one expected him to leave? Or maybe it's the question that lives between the lines of his life. What would you build if you stopped waiting for permission? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your story might be the next one that needs to be told. And if this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere, someone else is holding their own version of that homemade scope, wondering if it's enough. Maybe your belief in them is the shot they've been waiting for.
Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day we upload fresh stories packed with thrills, suspense, and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button. This channel is for you, and the best is yet to come.